rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Now I think we have Mr. Sullivan. Sure.
Pleasure, Commissioner. I appear for Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sullivan, would you just state your full name for the record?
It's James Andrew Sullivan.
And you wish to swear an oath for our firm?
I'll swear an oath.
Thank you.
I, James Andrew Sullivan, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to the Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Please sit down. Yes, Mr. Shaw.
Could I hand, Commissioner, the original witness statement to Mr. Sullivan? That's CRW 998-002-0120. Mr. Sullivan, could you have a look at that document on the screen? Is that your witness statement signed on the 4th of August 2021?
Yes, it appears so.
And if we go to page 0176, you can't see your signature there, but that's. I suppose I can't really ask if it's your signature. Can you see the signature on your screen, Mr. Sullivan?
I can't see it on the screen.
But that's your witness statement.
Yes.
Is it? There are a small number of corrections, Commissioner, that if I could take Mr. Sullivan
Certainly.
to, if we could go first, please, Mr. Operator, to paragraph 24. Oh, beg your pardon, I don't have the page number for that. Thank you. On that first line there, where it says 3 of them report directly to them, the word them should be me. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Next statement, paragraph 25A, where it mentions a technical and compliance manager. The word operations should be inserted after technical, so that should read technical operations and compliance manager Mark Kelly.
Correct.
And then all other references in the statement to that role is to Mr. Kelly's role as technical operations and compliance manager.
Correct.
Paragraph 61, please. Now, the correct document reference there should be, as I understand it, CRW.701.004.4660. Is that correct?
Correct.
Could you just repeat that number, please?
Yes, Commissioner. CRW 701.004.4660.
You.
If we go to paragraph 124. Thank you. On that first line, where I beg your pardon, I'm confusing myself with the word not in the first line. On the third line, grateful to my friend, the third line where it says this is a matter, that should read this is not a matter.
Correct.
Thank you. If we could go next to paragraph 168. Thank you. On the first line, the word never should be ever, so that will read, for this reason, I do not believe the rules have ever been incorporated. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. If we could have next paragraph 207. Thank you. And on the fourth line down, the word completion should actually be competition. Is that correct?
Correct.
If we could go next to paragraph 212. On the first and second lines, the word rated in each case should be deleted. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in next paragraph 213. And there are 4 instances, the same commissioners there, where the word rated is in line 1. Rated should be deleted. In line 6, at the end of that line, oh sorry, I missed one. Line 2, third word along. Line 6 at the end of that line, and the last full line, rated EGM paid game. Sorry, have I made those? I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then lastly, if we could go to paragraph 320, subparagraph C. Cats, hats and bats. To insert before bats, more, M-O-R-E, cats, hats and more bats. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is that those subject to those corrections? That's your statement.
Yes, it is.
Correct. Commissioner, that is the
Thank you.
examination.
The witness statement of James Andrew Sullivan, dated the 4th of August 2021, and bearing the identifier CRW.998.002.0120, amended as per the exchange this morning, will be admitted into evidence as an exhibit, and the mechanics of tidying up the statement can be worked out between the solicitors later on.
Grateful. That's the evidence in chief.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Sullivan, you've been the gaming product manager at the Perth Casino since 2008, is that correct? And one of the functions that you identify in your witness statement as being involved in that role is engaging with electronic gaming machine suppliers as to the products that Crown Perth wants to have approved and operated within the casino, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Now, in the course of today, I'm going to be referring to electronic gaming machines often, and when I do, I'll usually refer to them as EGMs for ease of reference. In terms of those suppliers, am I correct in understanding that there are numerous different companies that supply games to the casino?
Yes, there are.
and they include Aristocrat, IGT, Konami, SG Gaming, and YMAC, amongst others.
Yes, they do.
And these suppliers also provide EGMs to Crown Melbourne. Putting to one side the COVID restrictions, the number of EGMs that the Perth Casino is permitted to operate is 2,500, correct? But that's 2,500 spots, if you like, where an EGM machine can go. It's a matter for Crown Perth to decide what games go in those spots.
That's correct.
And so Crown might have an approved EGM in operation in a spot for a period of time, but then change it out as time goes by.
Yes,
And there's a reasonably constant turnover of games, isn't there?
there is.
As new games come in, there's typically a period of excitement and interest where the earnings in those games are relatively high.
Yes,
As time goes by, there's perhaps less interest, and eventually it gets to the stage where it makes economic sense to pay for a new game to get the benefit of that additional revenue. Is that right?
yes, that's correct.
In recent years, how many new EGMs on average would Crown Perth purchase in a year?
In terms of the physical machine or the actual game software that goes in the machine?
Both, if there's a difference.
Yeah, so in terms of the physical machine, sorry, your question was the last few years?
And again, taking into account that there may be differences of COVID, and perhaps
Yeah.
you can explain to the commissioners if there's an average and if it's changed as a result of that.
Yeah, I'd say probably in terms of the physical machines themselves, we would probably in a year buy somewhere between possibly 200 or 250 new physical machines. In terms of the software itself, that number would probably be somewhat higher, might be more like 500 to 700 bits of software, because you would be changing out the software in a machine multiple times generally.
And so does that mean, again, speaking broadly, that approximately a fifth of the games, software-wise, are changing every year at the casino, so the patrons will see a different game there?
Potentially that sort of volume, yes.
Okay. How much, in broad terms, does each EGM cost? And again, having regard to the hardware and the software.
Yeah, so the EGM itself, the physical hardware, probably costs, the prices vary by manufacturer, but probably range from approximately $20,000 up to possibly $26,000. And in terms of the game software, they might range at the lower end from possibly $2,500 to at the high end possibly as high as $6,000 or $7,000.
And is it the case that if a supplier has provided you with the hardware and that supplier then later develops new software, typically that new software can be loaded onto the same hardware box from the same supplier?
Yes, it does. Sometimes the generation of the box itself does change, so there may be some limitations, but generally speaking, the software has the ability to run on a box or one of multiple boxes potentially. There's a bit of variation there.
And is there compatibility between manufacturers, or is it generally that Aristocrat games run on Aristocrat boxes and Konami games run on Konami boxes?
That's certainly exclusively the case. So certainly an Aristocrat piece of software could only ever run in an Aristocrat machine. That's
Okay.
certainly the case across the board.
So in terms then of what you've described to us, in terms of the number of boxes and the number of pieces of software being purchased per year, it's running into the millions per year that Crown Perth is spending on new EGMs.
Generally speaking, yes.
And so it's a lucrative proposition for the EGM suppliers that I mentioned earlier to be able to have business with Crown Perth.
Yes, it is.
And in terms of your functions of engaging with those suppliers, do I understand correctly that one of the things that you deal with in terms of those suppliers is requests for them to develop versions of games which are in operation at other casinos for the Perth market?
Yes, generally speaking, they would look to leverage development they've done in other markets to see if that can be brought across to a Perth compliant standard, I suppose.
And similarly, you might also liaise with them and make requests or recommendations for new games or new features that you would like to see for the Perth market.
It's certainly that they would normally show us the products they are producing generally for all markets, and we would generally have a look at those. They would indicate which ones potentially might be compatible for the Perth market, and some may not. So we would focus on the ones that were available, and we'd have a discussion about which ones we thought jointly may be beneficial to move forward with.
And if you had identified that certain games were doing very well in the Perth market, perhaps that certain features or characteristics of those games were successful, you would communicate with the suppliers that you wanted to have more of those sorts of features or characteristics.
Certainly we give them feedback on which of their games generally are performing well or which ones aren't doing so well.
And again, as an important customer for those suppliers, they would try and accommodate whatever requests you had for them.
Yeah, I think they'd certainly take on board the feedback of what product was performing and seek to do more of what was successful and less of what was not successful.
And the way you describe it at paragraph 143B of your witness statement, and I don't need us to go there, is that you say that Crown Perth seeks to continually refresh, refine and update its EGM product offer to maximise alignment to customer preferences and demands. Is that correct? And so it's necessary as part of that alignment process for you to know what the customer preferences are, isn't it?
Yes.
And in order to find that out, you and Crown Perth carry out careful analysis of the usage of the EGMs that are installed at the casino, don't you?
Yes, we do.
And am I right in thinking that that analysis entails consideration of factors like looking at how often a game is in use by patrons,
Yes.
both in raw terms and in comparison with other games, how much money patrons are spending on the EGMs, and how long the patrons are playing on those games for. So how many games they're playing in a certain period of time.
Yes. Yes.
And am I correct in understanding that the number of games played from the time that a patron puts some credit into the machine to the time they take the credit out of the machine, that's known as a session?
Could be termed as a session, yes.
And is it correct to say as well that if you then get the average of the number of times that the patron hits the play button during that, that's sometimes referred to as the stroke rate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that just means how often they're hitting a button in a given period of time.
Yeah, the stroke rate is, stroke essentially refers to the number of games played, paid games played, and a stroke rate would be potentially within a period of time, yes.
And then your function, or part of your function, involves a detailed analysis of all of those attributes that we've just discussed.
Yes, I suppose the only thing I would say is there's probably two potential lenses through which you can look at that data, either from a product performance point of view or from a patron analysis point of view. So my team's predominantly involved in the looking at it from a product perspective in terms of how each individual machine and each game type performs. The detailed analysis of the actual customer side of things is actually done by a separate area of our business.
That leads into the next question I was going to ask you about, because my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the casino is collecting information about every game played at the casinos. That's the length of time, amount wagered and so on for all games. But then in addition, as you've just explained, there is also separate data collected where those games are played by persons with a loyalty card.
That's correct.
And then if a person is playing with a loyalty card, they insert the card into the machine while they're playing.
Yes.
And once they've done that, your system can then track that player and take the session data, the game data of that player, and keep it historically for that player.
Correct.
And so that over time, the casino can build up a history of the games the person plays, how much they spend, when they play, the average bets, all those sorts of factors. And is it correct to say that when a player is playing with a Crown Rewards card that can identify them, that's then referred to as rated play? And so so rated play makes sense for Crown Rewards. Unrated play would be if an anonymous player is playing?
Yes, that's right.
Are there any unrated play for an anonymous player?
Yes.
Are there any other types of descriptions of play type?
No, because essentially what occurs is, I believe the way the data collects is the system collects the overall data. It then understands what the rated information is, and I think the unrated is then the derivation of everything that wasn't rated is unrated, essentially.
Okay. But when you said everything that wasn't rated is unrated, again, it comes back to reinforcing the point that everything is collected.
That's correct. There's certainly data there for all of the information, and then you have a subset of rating information which enables you to then determine that the difference between the two numbers would be the unrated.
Next thing I want to ask you about is just in relation to some of the points that you made as to the structure of your role in your witness statement. And you said at paragraph 19 that until 2015-2016, you used to report to the COO, who was Lonnie Bossy at that stage. And then after that, you started reporting to the Group General Manager, Product Strategy and Innovation.
Correct.
And that's Peter Herring, who's based in Melbourne.
That's correct.
So what does that mean to you on a day-to-day basis to have your line manager based in Melbourne? Are you constantly in communication by phone and email?
Yeah, I'd say Mr. Herring and I certainly talk on a very regular basis. We have ongoing meetings throughout the week, so it's obviously a little bit different being in a physically separate location, but generally speaking, it operates the same with a little bit more separation than if probably someone was on site.
And there is an equivalent person performing a role such as yours also at Crown Melbourne?
Yes, I'd say broadly similar, maybe not completely the same, but certainly I think the function of my team is the structure in Crown Melbourne of the team is slightly different to in Crown Perth, but in broad terms similar in the analysis side of things.
And both you and your counterpart report to Mr. Herring?
Yes, that's correct.
And who is that counterpart in Melbourne?
In Melbourne, the person doing the analysis in Crown Melbourne would be a gentleman by the name of Attila Secchi.
So is it fair to say, again in broad terms, that the work that you do with EGMs in Perth, at an operational perspective, is seen as being equivalent to the work that's being done in Melbourne?
Would be broadly similar, yes.
And we'll come back to this point in more detail later, but I understand that the EGMs in Melbourne are commonly understood as poker machines. And you consider them to be poker machines. Beyond that description that we've gone through there as to your role in the structure, you say at paragraph 43 of your witness statement that you don't distinguish in your role between the operations of Burswood Nominees Limited, Burswood Limited, or Burswood Resorts Management Limited. You see everything as being essentially Crown Perth. Is that correct? Yes. To your knowledge, is that view common across other senior management at the Perth Casino?
I'm not specifically sure, but my guess would be if people aren't specifically dealing with very senior board level communication, I imagine people consider themselves more part of Crown Perth than specifically doing roles for the individual companies would be my impression, albeit I'm not 100% sure how others view it, but I think most people that aren't at that very senior level would consider themselves working for the business holistically.
And then you say at paragraph 138 of your witness statement that while you formally report to Mr. Herring, you also operationally report to senior management at Crown Perth. Can you just explain what you mean by operationally report?
Yeah, I suppose, although as you indicated, I previously reported to Mr. Bossy, so certainly if Mr. Bossy ever had a question, he would similarly come to me just like he used to when I reported directly to him. So certainly there's engagement I have with a lot of people on site. And Mr. Herring obviously not being here, I would be the person, potentially Mr. Bossy might come and ask a question if he couldn't get hold of Mr. Herring or wish to discuss it with me directly.
So to put it in crude terms, out of the two gentlemen, Mr. Bossy in Perth and Mr. Herring in Melbourne, who's the boss?
Well, my understanding is Mr. Herring, I believe one of his reporting lines is into Mr. Bossy, so I think ultimately through that path, Mr. Bossy is the ultimate boss.
And have you ever received a conflict in direction from Mr. Bossy on one hand and Mr. Herring on the other?
No, not that I can think of. I certainly think if Mr. Bossy had indicated he wished to have something done, I think both Mr. Herring and I would accept that Mr. Bossy's direction was the way we would attend to the matter. So I don't think that would arise because I imagine Mr. Herring would accept Mr. Bossy's view on the matter.
Then at paragraph 66 of your witness statement, you say that in around 2015, KPIs that were set for management roles within the business might have become more, quote, directed towards financial performance outcomes. Is that correct?
Yes.
And by that, do you mean making money?
Yes, I think within the KPIs there are ones that are specifically aligned to revenue or contribution targets. So I think it was those ones that are specifically financially focused that I believe the proportion of the KPI allocation to those KPIs may have increased around that point in time.
So a greater focus on those financial considerations or monetary considerations than on other considerations that had previously been the case?
Yes, I believe so.
And did any of those other considerations include things like the need to ensure that regard was had to responsible service of gaming principles?
My recollection, I don't recall that responsible gaming was ever a KPI as such. So I don't think it was, I certainly didn't perceive necessarily that responsible gaming was being deprioritised, but I don't think that specifically was within the KPIs from my recollection.
So it was never really a priority?
No, sorry, I'm not saying...
In terms of KPIs?
In terms of KPIs, I don't think it was included as a specific KPI, no.
Now, that change or that shift that you've described, do you consider in any way that that focus was a result of the group structure changing so that there was a model now being run out of Melbourne?
I'm not sure that I connected it to the group structure.
Are you able to say, and please say no if you're not able to say, whether you have discerned any difference in corporate culture between Crown Melbourne and Crown Perth in terms of a focus on that financial consideration or making money?
I think my impression would be and I'm not that close to the Melbourne culture, but certainly my impression would be there is a bit of a difference in the Melbourne and the Perth culture would be my general impression, yes. And
when you say a bit of a difference, does that mean a difference in terms of the focus on the financial outcome, or is it something else?
Possibly a bit more financially driven, possibly a bit more aggressive in their approach to business generally. That'd probably be my general perceptions.
But it remains the case, though, that it's always been important for Crown Perth as well to achieve financial growth and other financial KPIs.
Yes, certainly financial performance for Crown's business as a whole has always been
Now please call up crw.700.056.8406 and you'll see, Mr. Sullivan, this is a spreadsheet that sets out various projects at Crown under a heading of Operating Building for Growth Initiatives. If you can go to the second tab, please, at the bottom of that spreadsheet. Thank you. So you can see here we've got year ending 2009.
Right.
And there are various initiatives at rows 42, 43, 44 and 46. If we can get on to those, please. So looking there, you can see that your name is listed in column J, and then for those columns that I described before, 42, 43, 44 and 46, they're all about driving growth or increased EGM revenues. Do you agree?
Yes.
So you were the person who had been flagged to implement those policies and drive that growth, weren't you?
Yes, I suspect so, yes.
And did you implement them?
Could it be blown up? And I just wouldn't mind having a look across just to see what detail of the description there is against each of them.
So, operator, if you could please take this to the right a bit so Mr. Sullivan can see those further columns.
Is it possible to increase the size of that a little bit further as well?
We may have to return to this at another stage, Mr. Sullivan. We appear to be having a bit of a technical difficulty in the focus of that document. On the assumption that you were able to increase revenue, as was being hoped for by that spreadsheet, can you recall whether you would have given any implication at the time? Oh, here we go. We've now got the document back up.
It looks to me like probably some of those were implemented, others possibly not, but certainly it seems to be talking generally about the approval and implementation of new games and potentially some jackpots in relation to those new games. So I would say certainly a number of those were implemented, possibly others possibly not.
So in terms of implementing those new jackpots, and I understand that means providing additional funds for patrons to win as jackpots and EGMs?
Yeah, a jackpot is a prize element that normally sits on top of the base operation of the machine itself.
And in terms of implementing those, can you recall now whether you gave any consideration as to the RSG implications that might flow from the introduction of such jackpots?
No, I don't believe I did in my role.
And to be clear, when I say RSG, I'm usually referring to responsible service of gambling.
I understand.
Now, most of the questions I have today are in relation to EGMs, but I just want to make it clear what I'm referring to when I use that term, because you say in your witness statement at 133 that there are, broadly speaking, 3 different types of these EGMs operating at the casino. And you say there are table games, which is largely draw poker, keno games, and new style games. Now, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that draw poker is a name given to an EGM which replicates a card game, in that first, patrons are dealt a hand of cards. Second, they choose whether to hold or discard some or all of those cards. And third, they then dealt additional cards in place of the ones that they discarded.
That's correct.
So the term draw in draw poker comes from the fact you draw additional cards, is that right?
Correct.
And that emphasis on the fact that you can draw cards in the course of the game emphasises that the player interaction can change the outcome of the game.
Yes, it can.
Turning to keno, which again you mentioned at 133B, my understanding of keno, and again correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have a series of numbers, possibly 80 numbers, from which the player then selects up to 20 numbers.
I think for the games we operate, it may be up to 10, but I could be wrong.
And then the game selects an equivalent number of numbers from the numbers available, and you see how many match up.
Yes, I think, I'm not expert in the keno detail either. I think it might be 20 balls drawn and the players selected 10 out of 90 or something. So certainly it's players selecting some numbers and numbers being drawn and matching up the drawn numbers to the players' selected numbers in broad terms.
And in each game, the player will then make its choice of the 20 numbers before the game, or the 10 numbers before the game starts.
That's right, yes.
And keno, as I understand it, is a popular game that's played in casinos around the world.
Yes, to some degree, not so much from an EGM point of view, but it is a game that's historically been played in casinos and other gaming facilities.
And that brings us now to the third category of game, which you classified as a new style game.
Yes.
And am I correct in thinking that these games have, in broad terms, the following features? First, they're electronic games that rely on a random number generator to select a series of numbers when a patron hits a start or a play button. Second, the numbers selected by the game are then mapped against or checked against a series of pay tables to determine whether or not the series of numbers that have been generated constitute a winning sequence or series of numbers. Third, the game provides a visual representation of the numbers that have been selected by the random number generator and displays to the patron those numbers as symbols on a grid of some kind. And finally, while the player can make a selection prior to the game beginning, typically in terms of the amount to bet or the number sequences on which they select or which they predict a sequence will come up, there's otherwise no interaction from the player in the course of the game that can affect the outcome of the game. Now, have I got that right, or would you like to correct any aspect of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's broadly right. They are a game of chance, essentially, so they can't influence the outcome like potentially they could with the selections in a draw poker game. Yes, that's correct.
Now, you've provided a series of videos to the Commission showing different games that have been approved for use, and I'm just going to play a video and ask you to confirm that that's one of the types of games you had in mind when you're saying new style game. Can we please call up CRW.700.062.1037, and if possible, can we play that from the 45-second mark at this stage without sound? So just looking there at what we can see with the game being played, hitting a button and tiles flipping over to display a symbol. Is that the nature of the sort of game that you had in mind when you were talking about new style games?
Yes, that would be an example within that category, yes.
And at this stage, is there anything else that you want to tell the commissioners about the nature of new style games that you think it's important that they understand?
No, nothing specific I can think of, no.
While we were watching that video, we saw that the cards were flipping over in sequence.
Yes.
But it is the case, isn't it, that when a patron plays the game, the moment they hit the button, the random number generator has selected all of the numbers for the entirety of the game?
I'm not an expert on the exact inner workings of the RNG, but I suspect that's probably the case, that at the point of pressing the button, the RNG is probably making the selection as to the outcome that's been selected to be displayed.
Perhaps I can put it in this way. The sequence that we saw of the cards turning over, that is a visual effect which is not relevant to the operation of the internal math logic of the game.
I suspect that's the case. I'm not sure. I don't get involved probably in the detailed inner workings to that degree, but I think what you're saying makes sense to me, that that's probably how it occurs.
And it would be possible, again, broadly speaking, without going into the details too much, but it would be possible for the manufacturer to make a game which didn't have that delayed sequence of tiles turning over, but just instantly revealed everything at once.
Yes, I would imagine that's possible.
But the delay in having things turn over slowly, it's essentially a technique to build up excitement and have a sense of a feeling of suspense.
Possibly.
It makes the game more fun. Would you agree with that
Yeah,
suggestion?
I think certainly there's probably a little bit of anticipation in the process. So I think that would be a fair assumption. I'm not sure I've ever specifically asked that question, but I think that would be a fair assumption, that having it operate for a period of time probably adds something to the process.
And you'd agree, wouldn't you, that the extent to which a game is fun or appealing to the patron is significant in determining the extent to which persons will play on that game and spend money at the casino?
Yes, I expect it is.
Now, just going back to the distinction between the game maths and the graphics, because, as I understand it, there's this distinction between the maths and the pay tables and the random number generator and the graphical display of the numbers that are picked, that makes it possible for manufacturers to make clones of games which have the same maths but different graphics. Is that correct? And those clone games, from the perspective of a patron, they're a different game. They look different, they might sound different. Is that correct?
I would say that generally speaking, the customers will understand fairly quickly that a clone game is essentially a reworked artwork version of another game. So
Yes.
I think the customer would understand it, but certainly it would seem different in that the visual representation would look a little bit different.
But the thing I want to seize on from your answer there is that it's a reworked artwork. And so again, that emphasises that there is a distinction between the artwork of the game, the way it looks and sounds, and the operation of the game in terms of the selection of the numbers and the pay tables.
Yes, that's certainly the case, that a clone is changing artwork, but generally the mathematics in the background will be the same.
And the supplier would be able to change the artwork with relative ease as compared to the work involved in changing the maths component of the game.
It's certainly easier, yes.
Shifting topic now and moving to the system that the Perth Casino uses to monitor its EGMs. I understand that all of the EGMs are linked up and communicating at all times with a central monitoring server.
Correct.
And you explain at 267 of your witness statement that the CMS used by Perth Casino is provided by a company called IGT, and that's the IGT Advantage system.
That's correct.
And the communications from the EGM to the monitoring server are two kinds. You can have alerts or alarms, such as if there's a hardware fault. And otherwise, you have the information that we've discussed earlier, being that usage of the machine, that it's constantly updating the Advantage server.
Yes.
And the information that's being transferred will include, but is not limited to, the unique identifier of the EGM.
I think that might be entered at when the machine's configured, so I'm not sure that's been continually communicated. I think that's established at a point of configuration, possibly.
The game, which is loaded onto the EGM.
Again, I think that's done at the point of configuration, and that's a static position.
the time of day that the EGM is being played, or the time that the session starts?
For rated play, it would, at card in, it would log a time when the card went into the machine.
And which card are you referring to when you say card in? Is that the rewards card or a TITO card, a ticket in, ticket out card?
Apologies, it's a Crown Rewards loyalty card.
In addition to the information we've already discussed, would the machine be communicating the number of games that's been played in the machine?
Yes, it would.
How often that button was being hit, what we discussed before in terms of the stroke rate?
I think that would be a calculated or derived field in the background based on the time period of play and the amount of games being played. That would be calculated as a separate process, I think, at the back end of the system.
So it's measuring number of games played and time as raw numbers, if I understood your answer correctly.
I think certainly for rated play, everything in relation to rated play, because it has a start and an end time associated with it, it would be tracking time. I think for the unrated play, it is simply sending back the details without any time associated, because you don't have a start and an end point that gets created from a rating, if that makes sense.
So on that point, in terms of an unrated play, if I'm an anonymous person who goes to a machine and puts in $10
Yes.
and then plays for a while, the game doesn't say a session started when that $10 goes in. It simply says that game is part of all the games that have been played that day.
That's correct.
Okay. In addition to the information that it's sending forward, also the amount of money being won by the game,
Yes.
the revenue, the total amount being wagered on the game, which I understand is called the turnover,
Yes, correct.
and then lastly, the average size of the bet.
The average bet value, I think that's a calculation as well. So I think to get to average bet, you're taking turnover and dividing it by number of games played.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a derived calculation rather than being specifically sent back.
And where are those calculations performed? Are they on the machine itself that it's calculated, or is the raw data all given to IGT Advantage and then the calculations are performed?
Yeah, so I think there are certain data fields where the information is being sent from the machine back, and the ones that I'm probably referring to as the derived ones are the ones where the calculations occur within the back-end system based on the relevant pieces of data to calculate that outcome.
And is it open to Crown Perth to decide what calculations to perform to manipulate the data that it receives?
I don't believe so.
Once the data has been received from the machines, it's stored in a database,
Yes.
and from that point forward, it's open to Crown Perth at any time to carry out queries or otherwise do manipulation of the data in that database.
Yes. So, sorry, can I go back to my previous answer? Just in relation to where I said Crown can't manipulate the data. Certainly the way, as I understand it, the way the data is communicated is through the protocol and the operation within the software. So that's certainly not something that I think we would have any ability to influence. That operates the way it operates within the software, and we wouldn't be able to adjust that process of communication.
Obviously
at all, if that
misspoke. I'm
helps.
not suggesting that you would change the data in a way of trying to show different revenue earned or something like that. What I'm suggesting is that once you have the historical data from the machines, you can then analyse and manipulate and slice and dice it whichever way you like.
Certainly, once the data's in the back end, yes, there is analysis capability there. Yes.
Is that information that is available to Crown Perth available across the whole of the Crown Group? So can Crown Melbourne see what your local Crown Rewards players have done?
I think there's a couple of elements to that. So I think there is an ability for, and I think this came about through the group structure as well. Prior to the group structure, I think the position would have been people in Perth looked at Perth data, people in Melbourne looked at Melbourne data. I think when the group structure came into being, I think what then happened was you had some individuals in relevant positions that became what we refer to as probably dual licensed. So they could be licensed in Perth or in Melbourne, but there are restrictions that if you're not licensed in Perth, I don't believe you would have an ability to look at Perth data or vice versa.
Okay. Now, can we please call up CRW.701.004.4043? And while that's coming up, you say at paragraph 57 of your witness statement that there are various reports which you receive or generate on a regular basis, and then you've referred us to this report as an example of that.
Yes.
So if we look at rows 5 to 11, are these all rows that deal with tracking data that you can do on EGMs in the casino?
Could we just increase the size of that slightly? I'd say 5 to 8 are looking at the performance of EGMs in the casino. 9 to 11, they probably have some financial data in them, but they're more general reports about what has occurred over the trading day period. So probably some financial, but some other general commentary data as well.
And then the item that's in row 12, EGM performance by supplier. What's
Yes.
the point of that report?
My recollection of that is that basically, I think, graphs the performance of each supplier's product. So you can see on a sort of a trend line whether their machines are doing better or worse over time. And there, I think, is a report in relation to each of the individual suppliers there.
So that obviously is allowing Crown to see which games are doing well, and then it would assist you in identifying which features of other games you might want to be requesting in future.
It's probably not specifically looking at the game. It's more looking at, for that supplier, is their product holistically doing well across the mix of games that they operate versus another supplier in their mix of games.
So you'd agree that these reports that we have here suggest that Crown Perth has thought it was very important to analyse this data and constantly be reviewing that data.
Certainly, we do review the data regularly, yes.
In terms then of the people who receive all of this data, you can see that we've got under, I think it's column E, the report recipient destination, gaming machine department and multiple departments for some of them, and otherwise Crown Perth Management Group for others. Who is Crown Perth Management Group?
It could vary by report, so it would generally be, certainly for this list, myself, potentially members of my team, potentially Mr. Herring. For some of the reports, it may be Mr. Bossy or others. So for each report, there's probably a slightly varied group of management that might receive it.
Are the responsible service of gaming team included in that management group?
I don't believe they are for the financial performance items.
So for something like row 13, monthly top EGM players report,
Yes,
am I right in assuming that that is going to be the people who have spent the most money on EGMs in the month?
that is correct.
And it looks like, if I'm reading this correctly, that the report recipient is going only to the gaming machine department.
Yes, it is.
It doesn't go to responsible service of gaming people.
Not that I'm aware of that report, no.
Do you think it would be appropriate that those people be informed of which persons are spending the most amount of money in the casino so they can make sure that they're not suffering from any form of gambling-related harm?
Yes, I certainly wouldn't see any issue with that process. I don't have visibility as to what reporting the RG team do receive, so they may receive something similar, but certainly I accept your question that that data may well be of interest to them.
In terms of the analysis that generates all of these various reports, is that analysis done in-house? Is it Crown Casino's own work, or is it done by third parties?
Yes, no, I think that within our various IT departments and analytical teams, I think they basically build most of this reporting, potentially with some consulting maybe involved, but generally I believe it's all largely produced in-house within Crown.
And which persons then have access to that data once these reports are generated? I mean, we can see here who reports are sent to, but who then has access to reports if they want to look?
I think it would vary based on the report and who's building it. So, for example, some of the reports may be built by an analyst within my team, and there may be then an access list he would set based on our discussions about which people needed to see it. Other reports are generated and produced by from a team within our marketing team. So it may be in that case, while the marketing team may not be a recipient on the report that I'm aware of, they may have access to be able to look at the data. I would imagine they potentially have access. Whether that's something they look at, I'm not sure.
What about live session data? Are you aware of who can see what sessions are currently in play on an EGM at any given moment?
I certainly can't see that information. There may be, I think there may be some alert information in relation to large play activity, but it's not information that I see.
So who in Crown is seeing this? Is there a group, an IT analyst group? And if so, where are they?
I have a feeling it might be an operational group in relation to the operation of the Riverside or the Pearl Room teams. I think they may be the ones that may have looked at some reporting in that regard, but I'm not involved in it, so I'm not completely sure.
Are you aware of whether there's any terminal or access point in the responsible gaming room? I understand there's a responsible gaming room at the casino. Are you aware of whether there's a data access point in there for RSG staff to see?
I'm not sure.
Do you have any understanding or awareness of whether live data is given to the RSG team so that they can see what sessions are currently in use and keep an eye on those sessions to make sure there's no patron affected by gambling harm?
I'm sorry, I don't have visibility on data access.
Would you agree that that would be a sensible thing to do if it has not already been done?
Yes, certainly I would accept that they would see value in looking at data just the same as any other area of the business.
Now, in addition to being able to receive all that information, the IGT Advantage system can also send messages to patrons, can't it? I'll take you to paragraphs 271 and 272 of your statement, and you there refer to some messaging technology which apparently is not yet in use by Crown. And I'll just let you read that.
$271.
Yes. From you to Lonnie Bossy and others. If we can go to page 2, please, and then down to the bottom of the page, there's a heading called Advantage System Message Blast. And you can see that it would be possible to send updates to players, alerting them to things like how long they've been playing for.
I'm not exactly sure how it works, but it might be possible.
And assuming that to be possible, presumably they'd also be able to be informed of things such as how much they had lost over time while they were playing at that session. If you're not sure to answer, then it's...
Sorry, I'm just reading the description of the scheduled and the unscheduled message. I think I'm not sure that it is... I'm not sure that it's configured in a way... If I read scheduled messages as an example, it refers to sending a message the next time the loyalty card goes into the gaming device. So I think there may be some limits on the functionality rather than specifically when a trigger occurs, being able to configure the way it does things. I think it might be a bit more basic than perhaps what you might be thinking.
And I understand that obviously you're not in a position to say with certainty, but is it the case that Crown Perth has never investigated enabling this sort of messaging technology to message patrons?
I think this email would indicate that we looked at it, but we never ultimately implemented it as far as I'm aware. I don't believe it ever became implemented, but certainly this email would indicate that we were having a look at it at one point, I believe.
Yes, and it looks like from the middle of that page that the reason you didn't implement it was because of patron negativity as opposed to any technical limitation.
No, I actually think the reason why I was raising it here was there had been some patron negativity coming out of research, and I think I identified that one of the negatives the customers were identifying potentially could be addressed via the implementation of Message Blast. So that's why I think I was raising it as a consideration to address a customer negative that had been identified in some research.
Right. The next is...
Sorry, can I just ask, what's a DM?
DM is probably terminology we use, stands for direct mail. So that would be where Crown provides a direct mail offer that's basically a mail out to one of the Crown Rewards members.
The next technical issue I want to ask you about at the start is just in relation to the way that patrons can pay for their use of EGMs at the casino. I understand that initially when the casino first opened, that casinos were only able to be paid for by coins. So this is back in the 80s when the casino first opened. And so if you wanted to play a $20 game, you actually had to put in $20 in $1 or $2 coins.
Yes.
Then if you wanted to cash out from the game, you would finish playing, it would actually return those physical coins to you, and you'd have to take them to go and load into the next EGM if you wish to continue playing. You agree?
There is a slightly revised version of that, but certainly that was part of the process. If you want me to give you the other detail, I can, but certainly that was part of the process.
Well, certainly, is this how it was historically? I'm going to go through the sequencing as I understand it of how the machines have changed over time. So if there was something different back at the early stages, please let me know.
Yep, I might just explain. So generally what would happen if for example, you were playing and you had on your credit meter $15, if you then press collect and the machine had $15 within the hopper, which is the device that holds the coins, if it had the $15, it would pay you out the $15. If, for example, you had $300 on the credit meter and you press collect and the hopper only had less than $300, then what it may do is it may pay you out a portion based on the coins it has, then it would go into lock-up and a staff member would need to come out and pay you out the rest of that money. They would issue you a voucher for the remainder that wasn't able to be paid out by the coin, and that voucher you could then take to the cage, and then if you wished, you could either get notes if you wished to go home, or if you wanted more coins to go and play, you would then return to another machine with those coins. So they were the two pieces, I think, back in the early days.
Thank you. And so in terms of what you're describing there, it sounds like that style of play had lots of natural break points. If you wanted to shift from one machine to the other, either you'd be collecting coins or you'd be waiting for an attendant to come over. And so there was delay between those machine shifts.
Yes, certainly it was in some cases a time-consuming process, yes.
Then subsequently EGM started to be fitted with note acceptors.
Yes, yes.
When did this first start to happen, if you were aware?
I think the note acceptors were before my time, so I can't talk to that in great detail. Certainly when I was there, there were some older machines that were coin only, but I think the note acceptors were certainly well rolled out by the time I started with the business. So I'm not sure exactly what the timing would have been for when they were introduced initially at Perth Casino.
And when they were introduced, was there any limit on how much money could be put in by note?
Again, because they were introduced before my time, I'm not 100% sure. I certainly am aware of some of the historical limits, but whether they were just limits that by chance existed or whether they were part of specific regulation, I'm not exactly sure.
All right. And in terms of those historical limits, are you aware of any historical limits?
Yeah, so I think it did could vary by cabinet and by game. I think there was a game called Clown that might have been something around $250. From memory, I think $500 was about the largest I can recall historically.
And then once a person had finished playing on the machine and wanted to cash out, did the machine then return notes or coins to them at the end of that game? Or both?
Back in the early days, it was always if you were cashing out, it was either by coin or by the attendant servicing too. So it wasn't paying out by notes at all.
But again, when they paid out, it would either be, as you said, by an attendant coming and then you'd go to the cage to get money, or you'd get money out directly. But either way, you had that visual reminder that what you were getting out was money.
Yes.
And the next phase that happened in terms of what the machines could do to accept credits, as I understand, was the introduction in 2009 of CTS as part of the IGT Advantage system. Is that correct? And that system was a card-based system available only to those persons who were members of what was then called Club Burswood. And again, tell me if I've got this wrong, but as I understand it in broad terms, the system worked that by a patron who was a member of that loyalty program, they'd go along to an EGM and they'd insert their card, they'd load up some value onto the machine with notes or dollars, they'd play for a while. When they were done, they would take out their card, their loyalty card, go to a different machine and insert that card.
Yes.
They'd use a PIN number to then be able to access the funds that were left on that card from the first machine. Is that correct?
Yes, they were able to move funds around via uploading and downloading from their loyalty card. The only comment I would make in relation to that system is it was only ever implemented at Perth Casino within the Pearl Room facility.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the moving of funds around with that card, was there any limit to how much money could be transferred from one EGM to the other?
I'm not 100% sure on the transfer limit.
All right. I'm going to ask to be called up now, please. CRW.708.017.0305. This is a letter written by Senior Manager Gambling Regulation, Mr. Egan, back in 2009, and it's a letter associated with the Crown Casino's request for the implementation of IGT. At page 2 of the letter, at the third arrow point in the middle of the page, we've got some reference there to note acceptor limits and then a discussion about initial buy-in. So please read that paragraph.
Yes.
And can you explain to the Commission what is meant by the notion of a control over initial buy-in and whether it also means that there is no control over subsequent buy-ins?
Yeah, so I think what that's saying is that because the note acceptor has a limit of, I suspect at the time of this was probably $100 note acceptor limit. I expect what they were saying was then that the note acceptor would, the initial buy-in would be limited by that $100 note acceptor limit, and therefore in order to get beyond that amount, it would need to be winnings that would produce that size of value on the credit meter, I suppose.
So if I played a $100 note into a machine,
Yes,
I gambled twice,
yes.
I took my card out and went to the next machine, could I put in another $100 to take the credit on the machine using both note and the card to $200?
No, I don't believe so. I think what would happen is as soon as the credit meter, regardless of what is driving the amount onto the credit meter, as soon as the credit meter increments to $100 or more, the B&A locks out.
Okay. Then the final means of payment I wanted to ask you about is what I now understand is the predominant mechanism at the Perth Casino, which is ticket in, ticket out.
Yes.
And the way that this TITO system works is explained in a letter from Lonnie Bossy to Barry Sargent. That's CRW.708.003.5229. And if we could please have pages 5 and 6 up. So, firstly, the TITO scheme I think we've already discussed is not necessarily linked to the Crown Rewards scheme. Is that correct?
No, it can be used by a non-Crown Rewards member, that's correct.
So a player can walk up to an EGM and insert a note, and then once they're done playing that EGM, they can hit a button and the machine prints a card, the TITO ticket, and they can then take that card to a new machine and stick it in.
Yep, we would call it a ticket rather than a card, not to confuse with the loyalty card, but certainly a ticket would be produced, and it's based on the individual machine, which ones are capable of producing tickets or not.
And in terms of the ticket, unlike with the reward card in the Pearl Room, where there's a pin, the ticket has no pin, it's just the equivalent of cash.
That's correct, yes.
And is there any limit as to how much money can be put onto that card when going from one machine to the next?
Meaning the ticket?
Onto the ticket,
The
I'm
TITO
sorry.
ticket? I don't think, actually, I think there are TITO. I'm not sure about the TITO ticket limit. There may be, but I'm not 100% sure on those limits.
All right. And in terms of where you can get the Tito ticket from? Obviously, you can have it come out of the machine after you finish playing, if you first inserted some money at that machine. Can you also purchase a ticket elsewhere? Can you purchase it at either the cage or at a ticket redemption terminal?
No, I don't believe you can.
So you have to start on the machine and then load money on, and then you only get a card afterwards.
I think just to clarify, I don't believe you can buy a ticket from the cage. I think when you redeem, you can redeem cash from a ticket redemption terminal by inserting your ticket. I think when it can produce a residual ticket for the amount that it can't actually cash out, but other than producing a residual ticket for a relatively small amount that would need to be taken to the cage, it doesn't allow you to actually purchase a ticket from the ticket redemption terminal.
So at the start of the night, the only way you can begin your gaming is at a machine inserting cash into the machine. Is that correct?
Other than if you were someone signed up to CTS.
Yes. So it's not possible to go to the cage to start with and get a ticket. Is that right?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And in terms of the TRTs, is that the same process? You can't get a ticket from the TRT. You can only cash in at the TRT.
Yeah, no, I believe that's the case.
And is there any cash maximum that you can have returned to you at the TRT? I don't believe so. I think it would, if it had the cash there, I think it would cash out whatever value was on the ticket would be my guess. I'm not 100% sure, but that would be my sense of how it would operate. And in terms of when you then get the money cashed out to you, do you get a receipt or other form of documentation to show what amount of money you've had cashed out to you?
I'm not sure whether it produces a receipt.
If you go to the cage to have your Tito ticket converted to cash, do you receive a receipt there?
I'm not sure.
In terms of the amount of money you can have out of the Tito machine, would you be able to withdraw large sums, such as $5,000 or $6,000 out of the TRT? Are you aware?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the limits are there.
All right, I'm just going to shift topic and ask you some questions about the Crown Rewards loyalty scheme, which you've referred to on a number of occasions in your statement. My understanding is that any adult is able to join the rewards scheme for free. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And if we can call up dlg.0007.004.001, this is the brochure for the reward program that explains how it works. And if we can go to page 15, please. In broad terms, this program allows people who buy services with Crown to accumulate points and then make use of those points for other services. Is that correct?
Yes.
So on page 7 of the brochure, which I think is page 18, there's a list showing there as to the value of different services and how many points you gather. And you can see that for a $5 bet on a Crown gaming machine, you can get 1 point.
Yes.
And presumably the difference in point rating for different spend is that some of those services are more profitable than others. Is that correct?
Yes, I would expect so.
And for a gaming machine, we know that there's a 90% return to player ratio. So on average, if you're gambling $5, you're losing 50 cents.
Yes.
If we can then go to page 20, which is 11 of the brochure, and this explains how you can redeem points, and relevantly you can get exchange of those points for extra bets.
Yes.
And at the bottom, you can see that it's got 100 Crown Rewards points is $1.
Yes.
So for every $500 a person might spend gambling, they get 100 Crown Reward points, they get $1 in further gaming that they could use. Is that correct?
That appears correct, yes.
Now, just pausing there for a moment, you would agree, wouldn't you, that the purpose of the Crown Rewards system and the offering of extra credits to persons who have built up points is to drive growth for Crown's business?
Yes, I think it's about enhancing the experience of the offer to Crown's customers. Yes, I would agree with that.
And do you remember being a member of the steering committee in 2008 that considered the introduction of the IGT Advantage system?
Yes, I believe I was.
Can we call up, please, CRW.700.061.2313? And this document lists you at page 4 of the page 4 as a member of the steering team, but given that you've already acknowledged that, we don't need to go there. If we can go to page 2, please, you can see that under the heading bonusing extra credits, there's some discussion there about what extra credits allow. And it says this bonus is used to increase time on the device. You see that there in the second line?
Yes.
Then it goes on to say that Crown experience has proven that the increased ease at which point can be redeemed reduces overall point liability. Patrons earn and burn points with increased ease. And then again, it says increased time on the device, because players don't have to go to other places.
Yes.
That's what you understand the purpose and the effect of extra credits offered by Crown Perth to be.
Yes.
When you were part of that steering committee in 2008, did you have any concerns about the fact that there were these features designed to make people play on EGMs for longer, and whether that might have any responsible service of gaming implications?
I can't recall what the what was the date of this, 2008, 2009?
Yeah, 2008 was this document, and then 2009 is the letter requesting IGT Advantage be introduced.
I just can't recall at that, back in 2008, 2009, what the position was regarding the existence or operation of the responsible gaming function.
Let me ask the question to you this way. Do you have any recollection of anyone at any time while that steering committee was operating raising a concern as to this feature having an impact on responsible service of gaming?
Not that I can recall.
If we can go back to the reward brochure, please, at 0007.004.001, and then at page 22, which I think we have as page 14 of the brochure here, there is a sequence explaining how a person can make use of the extra play process. And that sequence there shows as being insert the card, the Crown Rewards card, into an EGM. Yes?
Yes.
Go into the menu for the game, choose points play, and the patron will then put in their PIN number to access their account details.
Yes.
And at that point, you can then play the EGM making use of the extra play credits.
Yes.
Now, you can see down the bottom of the page, it says that to use the extra play, you'll first need to put cash into the EGM.
Yes.
And I assume by cash, it means cash or any other form of value, such as a ticket in, ticket out ticket as well.
That's correct.
And the reason that you have to have that cash in the machine first is because when you first gamble, the machine's not taking the credit value from your extra play credit. The machine takes the credit value from the game credit meter.
Yes.
And I presume that that's so that you can't take your extra play credit and immediately cash it out for cash. And to your knowledge, does the system that's actually in use at the casino today work the way that the brochure says it does? In terms of that sequencing of the way the credits are used?
In terms of how it takes the money from the credit meter, then refunds out of the extra play account?
Yes.
Yes, that's my understanding of how the process works.
Thank you. Commissioners, I note the time.
All right. Mr. Sullivan, we take a 15-minute break, so we'll return at 11:30. Thank you.
All rise. Rise.
Please sit down. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Yes, Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr. Sullivan, just before we broke, I think the last thing that you had agreed with was that in relation to extra plays, when that system is used, the sequence is first the customer spends their own money, and then second, the casino refunds them an equivalent amount of money.
Correct.
Now, that's in relation obviously to the Crown Rewards system. Can I just ask you another question in relation to the use of the rewards card for rated play?
Yes.
How does that technically work? So if you sit down to play at a game and you put your Tito ticket in first, and then you put your Crown Rewards card in 5 minutes later,
Yes.
does it start rating from the moment your card goes in or from the time that you first put your Tito ticket in?
Yeah, so my understanding of the rating entries is that they are based on a card in and a card out event. So any activity that may have occurred outside of the duration of the card in and card out point would not be tracked by the system as I understand it.
Okay, and in terms of card in, card out, is that just the patron shoves it in the machine and then they pull it out, or is there a button to press to make it come out? How does that work?
Yep, so there's essentially what we call a card reader installed on each of the gaming devices, and the patron simply walks up with their physical card, inserts the card into that device. That is what we would refer to as the card in event. And when they, at some point in time when they've finished playing, they would then pull the card out. That would be the card out event, would finish the rating, and that rating information would be captured as one individual rating session.
So from the way you're describing it, it would not be possible for a patron to make use of one card to get rating sessions on multiple machines at a time.
No, correct.
We've been provided with EGM player data by the Perth Casino, and on some of that data there are instances of sessions which seem to overlap. Would that be, from what you're saying, simply a glitch in the system?
Is that, just to clarify, that's an overlap of the same customer with an overlap on a card in and a card out time?
So again, from what I understand from the analysis that's been done, is there is a session where it shows a start time and an end time of an individual session, and then there is a different session with a start and end time which overlaps to some degree the first session.
Both sessions being for the same customer.
For the same customer. So you're saying that you don't understand that to be possible?
Unless there was a slight glitch in the, if it was a short period of time, maybe a slight glitch in the timing possibly, but I wouldn't, generally speaking, that would sound unusual to me that would be the case.
Okay, thank you.
So what if a customer has two cards though?
Yeah, so I think there may have been some instances in the past where multiple cards did come into existence, but I have a feeling at a point in time what they came into place was, I think, what they call a sequence number, such that if your details are tracked back so that you had a card, for example, you lost it, or indicated to Crown that you had lost your card and got issued with another one, the nature of the sequence number would mean that if what you were attempting to do was to get a second card, the old card would be sequence numbered so that it was invalid once the second card existed. So I think the only anomaly that might work outside of that practice is if your details at the Crown Rewards desk were actually somewhat different, so you could, in theory, find a way to create two accounts, but within the same physical account. My understanding is the sequencing of the cards would avoid multiple cards existing.
Thank you.
And is that a recent change to have sequencing? So might there be some historical anomalies where people have two cards for the same patron ID?
I'm not completely sure. I certainly have a recollection of my understanding of sequence number. As to when it came into existence, I'm not sure, I'm sorry.
Okay. The other question I had, just going back for a moment to the discussion about those different forms of value and the CTS card and how it would hold value. Given that you're moving from one machine to the other with just the rewards card, and then you're logging on to use a PIN number to access those funds,
Yes.
does that mean that the customer essentially has an account with Crown Casino?
Yes, I believe they have. I believe it's essentially a CTS account. Yes.
And can they load value onto that account other than through the EGMs, say in the pool room? Can they go to the cage and load value onto that account?
I think they can go to the Pearl Room cage and load money into the account from the Pearl Room cage, I believe.
And do you know whether they can do that only via cash or whether they can do that via other mechanisms such as debit card?
I believe it would only be cash, but I'm not close enough to the detail to be 100% sure.
And are you aware of whether there's any maximum that they have in terms of the value those cards can hold?
I'm not sure.
One of the questions I asked you before the break was in relation to the Tito tickets and what the value was that they could hold, and I think you said you weren't sure about that.
Yes.
If we can please call up CRW.708.003.5229 and go to page 7. So can you see there in the top paragraph, this is that same letter in relation to IGT Advantage in 2009.
Right.
There's a discussion there about a maximum limit of $2,000 and $5,000 in the Meridian room.
I can see that.
And does that ring a bell? Have you heard those figures before, or is that not something which you're aware of?
I think the 2,000 and the 5,000 might ring a bell, so that may well be the case.
And okay, thank you. Turning then away from those documents, you mentioned at paragraph 37 of your statement that whenever a new EGM or technology is introduced at the casino, your team completes a form in relation to potential AML implications. Can you give the Commission some idea of what that means? What's an example of some of the consideration you've had for AML issues?
To be honest, in relation to most EGM games, while the form is completed, generally the games don't trigger any matters in relation to that form, simply because the payment devices and the insertion devices don't generally change. On some occasions where there's been a process change, those are more likely to be the areas that may result in a change to, say, limits or other things that would affect how much money could be inserted or withdrawn from a machine. So generally, most of the forms that we complete would not be raising matters. It would be more if there was an actual change in process rather than the games itself, would be my general view.
All right, now you talk about this a bit more in paragraph 72 of your witness statement. And you say that one step to deal with potential money laundering is that EGMs have to lock up and require staff intervention where you have a win of more than $10,000.
Yes.
And do I understand correctly that that's because it's equivalent to a $10,000 cash transaction and so it's something that needs to be reported?
My understanding is the position there is based on a stipulation within the national standard for the West Australian jurisdiction. It defines, I believe, a substantial win, and for Western Australia that has been set at $10,000, that any prize of that value or greater will go to lock up.
And does that mean that for less than 10,000 the machine does not lock up?
I think for less than 10,000 it doesn't inherently have to lock up per that requirement, but it may be there are specific settings within Crown Perth that may mean certain values lower than that may lock up, but it wouldn't be, I suppose, a requirement that it always lock up necessarily. So there may be some variability below the 10,000 value.
Okay. But you're simply not sure as to what the situation is?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure.
Are you aware of any possible scenarios by which persons could make use of EGMs for the purposes of attempting to launder money?
Not specifically, no.
Have you heard of the expression bill stuffing?
No.
Would you agree that a scenario that might allow persons to perhaps make use of the casino could be as follows? A person has cash to a particular value that they've gained through criminal activity, perhaps drug sales.
Yes.
They come into the casino and they go to a EGM. They insert a substantial amount of money in cash notes so as to generate a value on the credit meter
Yes.
into the hundreds of dollars, and they cash out, get a Tito ticket, perhaps go to another machine and load up again to reach a value into the perhaps thousands of dollars.
I think the only thing that would restrict someone's ability to do that would be the fact that the banknote acceptor locks out at the $100 would mean that would be as far as you could go without actually generating a win from the playing of the machine. So that bill note acceptor limit would limit your ability to just load up extreme amounts of money beyond the $100 limit, I suppose.
And so, again, to make sure I understand this, if you have the ticket value at $100, because you've gone to the first machine, you put in $100, at that stage the banknote acceptor locks out, is that what you're saying?
If I insert $100, be it notes or a ticket,
Yep.
the credit meter goes to $100. Once that credit meter is $100 or more, the bill note acceptor locks out.
So if I then take the ticket out, I cash the ticket out, I have a ticket in my hand, I go to the next machine, I insert it into the next machine,
Yes.
it's straight away at $100 value,
Yes.
I'm not able to insert any further notes, is that your point?
Yes.
Okay.
What if I go to another machine and put cash in first? So put $100 in first and then put my ticket in, which has, say, $99 on it. Or can I do that? And then
I think you could insert the ticket, yes. I don't think you can insert notes. The ticket may well be accepted. I'm not 100% certain, but I suspect the ticket would be accepted.
So picking up the Commissioner's question, if that's correct, you could then make use of that sequencing to constantly load the machine to the $100 maximum, then add the ticket that you already had, then cash out immediately, and then move to the next machine and repeat the process.
Yeah, I'm not certain exactly how that works.
Have you ever done any analysis on the EGMs at the casino to try and see what the ratio is of the amount of money loaded onto the machine versus the amount of turnover on those machines?
I think at points in time we may have looked at cash inserted or drop as a relative measure to turnover, but I can only recall it having been done once or twice.
So would you agree that that would be a way of determining whether machines were perhaps being used for the purpose of attempting to launder money if you had significant deposits and then very insignificant gambling before money is withdrawn?
It's possible. I imagine there may be some limitations to the data. I'm assuming if that was someone's motivation, they would probably not be using a card, in which case it may be difficult to track because you're not having a session, it's not linking back to a specific activity, so it may be hard to isolate, but you may be able to look at data to find something of value in there.
Well, for example, you say at paragraph 74 of your witness statement that you once spoke to Louise Lane about AML issues at the casino.
Yes.
Was this sort of issue discussed in that conversation?
I'm not sure we specifically discussed that scenario. Certainly she had an interest in understanding, from my recollection, insertion limits, withdrawal limits. I can't remember whether we specifically talked to ticket processing and those details. It's possible, but I suspect similar to now, I wouldn't have had all the answers for her on some of that detail.
To the best of your knowledge, is there any ongoing program of data analysis by Crown to attempt to determine whether EGM machines are being used for the purpose of money laundering?
Not that I'm aware of.
Moving on then to a different topic now, and this is in relation to potential gaming-related harm from EGM use. You say at paragraph 273 of your statement that you don't have an informed understanding of the data or statistics produced regarding the extent to which EGM players at Perth Casino have problem gambling issues. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But you have completed the online and in-person staff training sessions while you've been at the casino?
Yes, I have.
And is this the ongoing training that you identify at paragraph 38 of your witness statement? And that can be brought up, please.
Yes, the online training, I think, is refreshed on an annual basis.
As a result of this ongoing training, you'd be generally aware that gambling can be addictive and harmful.
Yes, I am.
And are you, again, generally aware that EGMs are commonly regarded as amongst the most addictive forms of gambling?
Yes, I am.
And are you aware that that's because of, or one of the reasons, that because the rapid rate at which players can play leads to the repeated activation of the brain's reward system?
In broad terms, yes.
If we can please call up CRW.700.067.1290. Now, this is Crown Perth's Responsible Gambling Code of Conduct Operations Manual. And I've asked the operator there to go to page 14, and you can see there's a heading there, addiction, in the middle of the page.
Yes.
And it explains that the DSM now includes gambling disorder as the sole condition in a new category on behavioural addictions, and that the new classification and its location reflect research findings that gambling disorder is similar to substance-related disorders in clinical expression, brain origin, comorbidity, physiology and treatment. Do you see that?
I see that.
So do you understand, in light of the general training you've received and the specific comments in Crown's own RSG operations manual and your work in this EGM area, that EGMs can result in the same kind of addiction as drugs of addiction?
Yes, I certainly would conclude that based on what.
And are you saying, by virtue of what I've just shown you, that you did not have any knowledge of this beforehand?
I don't believe I've read this document before, no.
Do you have before today, did you have a general understanding of the fact that these EGMs could result in the same kind of addiction as drugs of addiction?
I don't think I specifically, I knew there were addiction-related matters. I'm not sure I specifically was aware of them being linked to substance abuse type disorders.
Well, given that you're aware that there are addiction issues, I'm going to take you then to paragraph 278 of your statement, where you say that to your knowledge there's no activity, no specific activity, undertaken by Crown Perth prior to the introduction of new EGMs to assess whether they contain features which might lead to addiction or otherwise encourage problem gambling.
That's correct.
Do you have any answer as to why Crown Perth does not engage in that sort of analysis or assessment before obtaining new EGMs?
Elements. I don't believe Crown has a practice in addition to the allowance of those factors within the design to do their own testing of those.
And that's something which has been constant, to your knowledge, throughout the 17 years that you have been working with EGMs at Crown Perth?
That Crown hasn't had this, its own practice?
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, that is consistent, yes.
And then at paragraph 282, you essentially make the same point that there's no assessment of EGM games once they have been acquired to see whether they contain features that might lead to addiction.
Not that I'm aware of.
And again, same question, in the 17 years that you've been working in this area, has there ever been, to your knowledge, a review of any EGMs at the casino to assess whether there might be harmful features on those EGMs?
Not that I'm personally aware of.
Are you aware of Crown Perth ever conducting any research, whether by itself or through retaining someone else to carry out research on the casino's behalf as to the extent to which EGMs might be causing harm?
I'm generally aware that gaming research is something that is looked at, but whether it's specifically, I don't see that research, so whether it's specific to EGMs and what it contains, I don't have, other than a general familiarity of the use of research, I'm not sure of the specifics.
You said words research was looked at, but my question was if you're aware of whether Crown itself has commissioned its own research or done its own research as opposed to looking at others' research.
I have a general understanding that they have engaged RG consultants in relation to certain projects, but as to whether it's specifically in relation to EGMs, I'm not certain.
By contrast, at paragraph 260 of your statement, you explain that EGM usage data has historically and is currently been analysed by the gaming product team.
Yes.
And that's to assess the financial performance of those games at Crown Perth, and then you say that that's to determine the relative usage of those games and determine whether changes to the game mix might better align to current EGM usage.
Yes.
So you're constantly looking at which games are the most popular and make the most money.
Yes.
And no doubt, again, that's to make sure that you secure games of that type into the future to continue to provide a product mix that makes the casino money.
Yes.
And so the types of games that you're going to be seeking out and having supplied will inevitably be the ones that are most attractive and compelling to customers because they're the most used games.
Yes, you would generally produce more of the more popular games, I would expect.
And would you also agree that the games that are the most compelling and attractive to people are also the games that are the most likely to lead to people playing at levels which may cause them gambling-related harm?
I certainly accept there could be a connection there.
Are you aware of whether the Perth Casino takes any steps to try and balance the tension between those two things? On the one hand, the desire to get EGM games which are attractive and compelling, but on the other hand, not to get EGM games whose features are so compelling as to result in addiction or other gaming-related harm.
I'm not aware of the specifics of what the RG team may do in that space.
Well, let me ask the question this way. When you buy a EGM game,
Yes.
do you consult with the RSG team and say, is this game okay?
No, I don't.
So there is, in short, zero input into your purchasing decisions from an RSG perspective.
Yes, that's correct.
I'm going to ask you now about two issues relating to the manner in which EGMs are used at the Perth Casino and the extent to which that usage might have impacts for RSG. And the first thing is something called losses disguised as wins. Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
Can you explain to the commissioners what you understand that term to mean?
My belief is the term is meant to refer to when a player places a bet for a certain amount of money, the win they receive is for a lower value than the value of their bet. And then there is some sequence associated with the awarding of that value, despite the fact it's less than their bet value. I think that is what's referred to as a loss disguised as a win.
Can we please call up CRW.700.062.1039? And this is one of the videos that you provided.
EGM win celebrations and game approval process presentation delivered by Crown Perth to the Gaming and Wagering Commission of Western Australia in October 2018. We understand Commission members recently made inquiries in relation to the operation of EGM win celebrations, including the potential for such game elements to be considered when EGM games are presented for in-principle approval. Accordingly, Crown's prepared a presentation to provide greater insight into various aspects of how EGM win celebrations are implemented, including examples of win celebrations incorporated in a recently approved Crown Perth EGM game, being a game developed by the approved supplier Konami named Stacks of Magic. While individual suppliers may implement EGM win celebrations slightly differently, we consider the examples provided are broadly reflective of the general approach taken to incorporating such win celebrations in Crown EGM games. In considering EGM win celebrations, it's necessary to establish how the term win is defined. Based upon consideration of various definitions in the Australian-New Zealand Gaming Machine National Standard of 2016, commonly referred to as the National Standard, a win is broadly defined as the value of a prize awarded when a specified game symbol outcome is displayed. Further, each EGM game incorporates a pay table which details each game symbol outcome which results in a prize award and the prize value associated with such game symbol outcomes. Each EGM game win will result in the display of some form of win celebration sequence in order to ensure that game wins are clearly displayed and highlighted to players in accordance with national standard requirements. A win celebration sequence will generally consist of the following elements. Firstly, visual elements. So it will often incorporate the highlighting, flashing and/or animating of the game symbols making up the winning game outcome, and incrementing the value of the win meter to ultimately display the accumulated value of any and all prize awards. It will also generally incorporate audio elements, being the playing of a musical tune. The nature and extent of win celebration sequences incorporated in an EGM game may vary based upon such factors as the value of the prize or prizes being awarded and or the value of the prize award relative to the value of the player's bet. The screenshot shown on the slide highlights aspects of a win celebration sequence as incorporated in the game Stacks of Magic, and you'll see these reflected in the videos that we'll play shortly. So if we look at the red border at the top right of the image, it basically highlights the win meter on the game, which is where we see the incrementation to reflect the value of the prize won by the player. If we move down to the central section, surrounded by the blue borders, you'll see some of the symbols that can animate as part of the winning celebration sequence. And finally, if we look at the image surrounded by the green border towards the bottom of the image, you'll see it's got this yellow or gold border surrounding some of the symbols, and that's highlighting the symbols making up the winning outcome. We'll now play a series of short gameplay videos illustrating different game outcomes and related win celebrations as incorporated in the game Stacks of Magic. In all cases, the game's being played at a bet value of $1.50. So following are the details of the different forms of game win incorporated in each video. Video 1 is an example of no game win with a win value of 0. Video 2 is a small game win with a win value of $1.25, which is slightly lower than the player's bet value of $1.50. Video 3 is a medium game win with a win value of $31, or approximately 20 times the player's bet value. And finally, video 4 is a large game win with a win value of $75, which is approximately 50 times the player's bet value. This is video 1, no game win. This is video 2, the small game win. This is video 3, the medium game win. And lastly, video 4, the large game win. We understand it was queried whether final win celebration sequences can be incorporated in an EGM game when it's presented to the Commission for in-principle approval. Unfortunately, the nature of the process by which suppliers develop EGM games is such that win celebration sequences are one of the final elements of the game development process. As a result, when all games are presented for in-principle approval, they generally incorporate limited, if any, win celebration sequence elements, and such elements are reflective of a preliminary rather than a final form of implementation. That concludes the presentation that was delivered to the Gaming and Wagering Commission in October 2018. The 4 win celebration videos presented here and forming part of the presentation delivered to the Gaming and Wagering Commission in October 2018 cover a range of win outcome scenarios, specifically no win, a small win, a medium win, and a large win, and as such, in my opinion, are likely to broadly reflect the type of win sequences that may exist in Crown Perth EGM games generally.
So just picking up on the last thing you say in that video, where you say that the sequences we saw there broadly reflect what happens across EGM games throughout the casino. Can I take it from that all or otherwise most of the EGM games in the casino would play a sequence similar to what we saw with the small win sequence if a patron had returned to them a prize that was smaller than what they bet?
I would expect something similar to that, yes.
Okay. And you would agree that what we saw with the small win was a celebratory sequence?
Yes, it was.
There was obviously that jaunty tune playing, the woman wearing the witch's hat blowing kisses to the player, all of which would signal to the patron that they have had a win of some kind.
Yes.
And as you say in the video, the reality is that the patron has lost 25 cents on that bet.
They have.
Now, do you understand that the reason why losses disguised as wins are something which have been studied and to which regard has been paid is because of a concern that they are likely to be an addictive feature?
Yes, I think I'm broadly aware of the concern there, yes.
And the idea being that if the patron is constantly being told, you've won, you've won, you've won, that's triggering their reward system again and thereby potentially leading to addiction.
Yes, I understand that.
Are you aware that some jurisdictions in Australia have prohibited this sort of loss disguised as win?
I believe I may have become aware of one recently.
If we can call up, please, pub.0016.0020.0001, and this is the Tasmanian appendix to the Gaming Machine National Standard. And you can see, I think it's T3.16 on page 6.
Yes, I see that.
And on your reading, that would capture the sort of celebratory sequence we saw for the what you termed a small win in the sequence we watched earlier.
Yes, it appears so.
They still have poker machines in Tasmania, don't they?
I believe so, yes.
So getting rid of a loss disguised as a win doesn't have the consequence that you won't be able to source further EGMs in the future, does it?
No, I wouldn't have thought so, no.
And there's no technical reason that the Perth Casino couldn't prohibit losses disguised as wins on its EGMs, is there?
I wouldn't have thought so, no.
Might mean that the EGMs are a little less profitable,
Possibly,
perhaps a little less dangerous.
possibly.
You also explained in that video that we watched that the winning sequences couldn't ordinarily be shown to the GWC because it's one of the last things that gets done in the game development process.
Yes.
Now, that emphasises again the fact, doesn't it, that there's this schism or disconnect between the game maths and the random number generator and the graphics and the sound that is used to present the game to the player.
Yes.
Like all visual elements of the game, that winning sequence is an add-on to that maths aspect.
Yes, I believe so. Separate. Yes, I see that.
And if we can go to the next page, please. And this next page basically steps out and says that from Crown's perspective, they consider that the manner in which they operate their RSG programs will mitigate against any potentially harmful effects.
Could that just be blown up a little bit more? Yes, I see that.
So accepting that Crown drew attention to its RSG program and then explained the measures that they had in place that they said would be helpful in ameliorating any effects, would you agree that there was a failure to properly articulate to the regulator risks that Crown itself had recognised.
Well, is this, Commissioner, is this a comment on the letter now, the one that this witness has not said that he's seen at all? And is just looking at this for the first time?
Yes, just clarify that, Mr. Lee.
Yes, thank you. And again, as has been suggested, I'm not asking whether you failed to provide information to the regulator. I'm asking whether you agree, in light of the documents that we've seen so far this morning and the concerns that people had within Crown, that Crown, the corporation, failed to articulate to the regulator risks which it had recognised as being inherent with the TITO system that was being introduced.
Well, again, is that a question about the contents of this letter, or is the content, is it a communication at or about the time the letter was issued?
Again, please clarify, Mr. Lee.
Yes, and the question is in relation specifically to the letter that's going to the GWC, and whether you agree that what is being set out in the letter does not articulate the...
Well, can I, at the risk of jumping up and down too much, Commissioner, we've gone very quickly through this letter. There's a question now asked about the whole of what was or wasn't put to between Crown and the regulator, without looking through the whole letter, without establishing anything about this letter, just looking at this one little part of it, and asking for an opinion about something that this witness wasn't even involved in.
I think the witness has said that his knowledge of his personal knowledge of these matters is pretty sparse. Isn't
Yes.
that a reasonable summation of what he said?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I, in that case, proceed on to perhaps ask a different question in relation to this letter. If it can be please taken back to CRW.705.005.4587. And if we can look please at page 4. You see in the second paragraph, under the heading Sale or Uploading with Value of Tickets, there's a comment there suggesting that one measure to deal with RSG issues would be to limit the amount that can be accumulated on a ticket to $199.
Yes, I see that.
And I think we went earlier after the break back to the letter that had been sent by Mr. Bossy to the GWC at this time, and we saw that the proposed transfer amount was $2,000, didn't we?
Yes, I believe we did.
So, to the best of your knowledge, in terms of the system that's currently operating at the Crown Perth Casino, that's not a system which incorporated the safety mechanism that was proposed by Mr. Egan.
Don't believe so based on those two pieces of information, no.
Then at paragraph 4 of this page, you can see there's a comment there about the possibility of introducing other harm minimisation measures such as pre-commitment and player activity statements.
Yes.
Now, my understanding is that there's no mandatory requirement for either of those systems at the casino at the moment. Is that correct?
Don't believe there's a mandatory requirement, no.
However, those options are offered on a voluntary basis.
I believe so, yes.
And can you explain to us the pre-commitment system, which I believe is called play safe limits?
Yes.
Can you explain to the Commissioner how that works?
In broad terms, my understanding of play safe limits is the patron has the option to set either, I'm not sure whether it's one or potentially two limits. One, I believe, is a daily spend limit, and the other is a daily time limit. So one would be the amount of money they would allow themselves to spend or like to set to be the value they would spend within a day. The other would be the amount of time they could spend gaming within a trading day. I believe those are the two key limits within the system.
What happens once a person goes past those limits?
I believe what happens, I'm not expert in this system, but my understanding of what happens is that a message would be displayed to the customer advising them that they had met one or other of those set limits.
My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that once you reach the limit, the consequence is that you then stop accruing loyalty points while you play, but that you are not locked out from playing. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So it's not really a limit, is it?
Certainly not in terms of not allowing you to play.
Would you agree that what it really is an incentive not to turn on that facility, because doing so won't stop you from gambling, but it will stop you from getting any potential reward if you keep gambling?
I don't believe that's the intention of it, but I do accept it's not forcing you to stop playing at the end of the process. I certainly do appreciate that.
Are you aware of what the level of uptake is for the pre-commitment service?
I'm not specifically aware, but my impression historically has been that it has been relatively low.
Can we please call up CRW.563.008.7968? Now, these are the meeting minutes of a Responsible Gaming Management Committee meeting in November 2020. I don't believe that you're a member of that committee.
No, I'm not.
Do you ever receive the minutes for those meetings, or is that not something you get?
I don't believe I received those minutes, no.
And is that even if what's being discussed by the committee might dovetail into the area of EGMs?
Could you just blow the minutes up a little bit? I don't believe I've ever seen a set of minutes from that meeting.
Okay.
Would be my recollection.
If we can please go then to page 30. And you can see, looking at this table and judging by the heading, that this is where Responsible Gaming have provided assistance of various kinds to patrons. Would you agree?
Yes.
And if we look in the middle of the page, we've got play safe limits, and they specify then a series of dates between, I think it's 2020 up until January, February, March of 2021.
Yes, I see that.
And you see that there's only one play safe limit imposed in November 2020 and then nothing in any of the other months.
See that.
The fact that there is the capacity for play safe limits to be imposed, does that suggest that the RSG team have the capacity to interact with Crown's data holdings and rewards system to turn on those limits? Or is it the RSG team that does enable these limits? Are you aware of that?
I believe the way the system works is that the individual gaming devices are enrolled within the Play Safe Limit program within the Advantage system, and I believe my team configure that within the system and set that up within the Advantage system.
So the sequence would be, if I have this correct, that a patron approaches perhaps an RSG staff member and makes a request, and then it's given to your team to implement. Is that right?
Sorry, my apologies. Maybe if I explain that a little bit clearer. My team do the configuration that ensures all the relevant gaming devices are enrolled within the PlaySafe system so that play on all of those devices contributes to the limit. The actual patron side of determining they wish to enrol in the program and set a limit, I'm not involved in that part of the process, but my expectation would be that the customer would go to a Crown Rewards desk and indicate to the staff member at that desk they wish to set some limits, and I expect the Crown Rewards staff member would walk them through that process and set that up for them on the system.
Okay, if we can now go back please to page 22, we can see that in the same time period, if you look at the self-exclusions in the top left-hand corner, it looks like there's 116 people who have self-excluded.
Yes, I see that.
Would you agree that generally speaking, a person would only seek to self-exclude if they have been gambling to the point that it has caused them harm and they wish to try and prevent any further harm?
I certainly accept there would be you would imagine there's a reason for them taking that action.
So generally speaking, and knowing we don't know about these individual cases, this suggests that there's something like 116 people at the Perth casino who have suffered harm in a period.
I don't know. First of all, the answer that witness gave to the previous question, I was a bit concerned about that. This is taking it a bit further. I'm not sure that can be. It's not suggested that was an acceptance that there are 116 cases of self-harm. The witness didn't accept that.
No, I think that's right, Mr. Lee. That what the witness says, you put it to the witness that a self-exclusion, it would maybe indicative of in an individual case of a person feeling that they need to limit future harm, but it doesn't follow that there has been actual harm.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't take that question any further, but I just would note for the benefit of the transcript that CRW.704.001.3898 at page 23 shows some additional minutes for other meetings, and the play safe limits for those meetings again suggest that there is very few or no persons making use of play safe limits and a high number of persons making use of self-exclusions. Having had me just say that in broad terms, is that consistent with your general understanding of how those systems work at the casino, that there is a higher use of self-exclusion than of the play safe limits?
I don't believe I would have ever had access to see the volume of self-exclusion, so I don't believe I see specific data, be it in relation to the sign-up numbers for play safe limits nor for the self-exclusion numbers, so I wouldn't be suitably informed to understand the relative position.
Would you accept that, seeing the figures that we did look at a moment ago, that one person in 4 months is making use of the play safe limits,
Yes.
that it suggests that that system is not really being utilised?
Certainly your data aligns with, I think, my initial comment that my understanding was the uptake was limited, yes.
And do you recall that when the system was presented to the GWC, play safe limits were articulated as being part of the IGT Advantage system?
I believe so.
So if we can just please call up GWC.002.0016.0016. Now, page 2 of those minutes show that you were at the meeting in order to help present to the GWC. And you can see there's a reference to you at the top there of point 4.3.
Yes, I see that.
You can see there's some concerns at the bottom of the page there from Member Hayward as to identifying patrons that may be induced to visit the casino.
Yes.
And if we go over the page, please, to page 3 at the top, and you can see in the middle of the first paragraph on that page, starting at the end of the 4th line, there's some discussion there about the play safe limits technology and how that's an additional tool to monitor player behaviour.
Yes, I see that mentioned.
So would you agree that that's a tool that was explained to the GWC as something that would be useful, but that it doesn't appear to be being used?
I certainly see it being presented there to the GWC, and I accept that based on what I've seen of the usage data, it appears to be very low.
Now, in relation to then player activity statements, which is a different concept, can you, are you aware of what those are?
I'm aware of what the broader concept of what the statements are, yes.
And can you just explain to the Commissioners your understanding?
My understanding is that the player activity statement is produced for a period of time and basically summarises the player's gaming activity. I'm not sure exactly the source of production of that statement, so I'm not sure exactly which gaming activities it may include or exclude, but certainly I believe it records a certain player's gaming activity for a period of time.
Now, it sounds like from the way you're answering that question, this is not really something within your bailiwick, is that correct?
No, that's right. I understand the concept of it, but I'm not familiar in any detail with the player activity statement program.
Are you aware of the fact that in Crown Melbourne, it is compulsory for the casino to provide player activity statements to patrons who have a rewards membership on an annual basis?
I think I may have been aware of that, yes.
And that if the patrons don't collect their player activity statement to see what their gambling has been, that they are then obliged to either cancel or suspend their loyalty membership.
I'm not sure if I was aware of that.
Would there be any reason, any technical reason, why Crown Perth could not roll out a similar requirement that players who wanted to take part in the loyalty scheme were obliged at some regular basis to receive a player activity statement?
I don't believe so, no.
Just to change tack now, Mr. Sullivan, and talk a bit about poker machines. You're obviously aware that Section 22(1) of the Casino Control Act allows the GWC to declare any game to be approved except for a game played with poker machines. Have you seen that before?
Yes, I understand that.
And then you deal with that at paragraph 157 of your statement, and you say that your understanding is that the term poker machine refers to a spinning reel gaming machine.
Yes.
And if you could just explain to the commissioners what you mean by that term.
A spinning reel, to my terminology, basically means a game that operates in most gaming jurisdictions around the world, and the visual representation of the game. Back in the early days, it was a physical reel that was actually spinning within the machine, but over time became a video representation essentially of a reel spinning and stopping at a point and displaying a number of symbols. And in a lot of those games, they have 5 reels, each displaying 3 symbols next to each other. So that's my broad understanding of what that term means.
Now, we've got a video that was presented by Mr. Connolly at an AUSTRAC Casino Regulators Forum in which he says what he thinks a spinning reel machine is. And I'll ask you to say whether you agree with that assessment. It's GWC.004.0019.006. I think it might be slide 7 or 8. 8. Is that what you describe as being a spinning reel game?
Yes, that would be consistent with my understanding.
And you say that that is, in essence, what you understand to be meant by the term poker machine?
Yes, I believe so.
So is that the only difference that you believe exists between EGMs at the Perth Casino and poker machines that are played in other jurisdictions?
So my understanding of that distinction is that it is based upon, I suppose, 2 factors. One is the factors detailed within the WA appendix to the Gaming Machine National Standard, and 2, any other factor determined by the Gaming Wagering Commission in the approval of EGM product in Western Australia.
All right, but in terms of where you say in your statement that that's what it means, it's a spinning reel game, the way you describe it in that statement makes it seem as if you consider that's the only feature which is important in determining whether it's a poker machine.
I suppose I was just providing a simplistic explanation of what I thought a spinning reel broadly meant, but certainly the factors within the WA appendix, there are, from memory, 10 or 12 different factors there, so I don't understand, or can't reel off all of those details, but certainly there are a range of factors detailed there that are creating distinction.
So do I take it from what you just said there that your understanding of what a poker machine is whatever the GWC says at any given time in the WA appendix? Is that correct? Or do you say that there's some essential characteristic which is always relevant to that determination?
No, I think what I'm saying is I think a poker machine remains what it is, and then there's a series of factors that within the WA appendix to the national standard that the Gaming and Wagering Commission have determined are distinguishing factors to separate a game that would be approved for operation in Western Australia from a poker machine or spinning reel.
So it sounds like there's almost a 2-step process. Step 1 is what you understand to be intrinsically a poker machine, and then step 2, additionally, is what the GWC might make use of for its own policy determinations.
Yes, as to what is then not a poker machine, which would be approvable.
If we can call up CRW.709.111.0195, and this is an email exchange between you and other Perth casino officers in February 2015.
Yes.
Now, the second paragraph there deals with what appears to be your understanding at the time, and I'll just let you read that.
The second paragraph?
Yes.
Yes, that provides some degree of explanation of the matter.
So, do you agree that the paragraph there suggests that you previously understood it to be significant as to whether machines were poker machines or not poker machines, whether they had any of the distinctions that are mentioned in that last sentence of the second paragraph?
Sorry, can you ask the question again?
So, at the time this was written in 2015,
Yes?
do you agree, looking at that last sentence in the second paragraph, that you then thought that the distinctions you set out in that paragraph were significant in determining whether or not a machine was a poker machine?
I think I certainly identified those as examples of the factors that were in the minds of the Commission in making that distinction, yes.
And in that case, in the absence of these distinctions that are mentioned in that last sentence, would you be of the view that getting rid of those distinctions would mean that an EGM would move closer towards being a poker machine?
I would accept that if you remove factors, the level of distinction would diminish as you remove factors. I would certainly accept that. That makes sense.
And in terms then of what a spinning reel game is, that video to show an example of one, you would accept that they are still at their core a random number generator with a visual overlay.
Yes, I believe so.
And again, when the button to play is hit on the random number generator, it selects numbers and sequences and then presents them to the player, showing whether there's a win or not.
Yes.
And that process again happens immediately the button is pressed, the result is instantaneous, and then after that the graphics display it.
I believe that's likely to be how the process works.
And so if the manufacturer of a spinning reel game wished to, they could display the way in which the result was presented to the patron in different ways.
Yes.
And whichever way that was chosen to show the result to the patron, whether it be by way of a spinning reel or cards turning over or any other mechanism, would not change the underlying operation of the game.
Subject to consideration of other factors that may apply.
Which sort of factors are you thinking about?
Well, if you looked at the factors within the WA appendix, there's a range of things that are identified there as being separate and distinct on a Perth EGM relative to a spinning reel.
Well, we'll come to the appendix in a moment, but just in terms of some other factors that we were able to see in that video, the quality was not good, but could you hear from the sound a single button being depressed between each spinning of the reels? If you couldn't, that's fine.
I couldn't, and my understanding is one of the distinctions between West Australian EGM games and spinning reels is the requirement for a separate play button. I don't think that requirement exists in most spinning reel jurisdictions.
So when you say for a separate button, is that a physically different button on the actual panel that the player is playing on?
Yeah, it's a separate button distinct from the actual bet buttons themselves.
So just make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying that in a place, say Melbourne, you might have a series of buttons along the machine.
Yes.
And one of the buttons might be a amount to wager button, like a credit button.
Yes.
And you would simply hit the credit button and that would commence the game. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if I can explain it, there's generally speaking on most spinning reels, I believe, a two-factor bet selection process. So my understanding of how it works in a spinning reel environment is once the second of those bet selection processes is completed, as you press the second button, the play sequence will commence straight away. You don't have the requirement for a separate play button press as exists in Western Australia, as I understand.
Okay, so you, for example, with a poker machine, might go number of credits to bet,
Yes.
and the value of the credit, and then it would start playing.
Yeah, it would generally be number of credits and say number of lines or something else potentially. As you made that second selection, it would then immediately commence the gameplay process without the requirement for a separate play button.
And how would the player then commence subsequent games?
I think they can either press the same button again. In some cases, they do have a play button as well. I think what they call a bash button, which is a separate button. So they could either press the same secondary button they'd pressed before, or alternatively another button.
Okay, so the sequence is select, as you said, betting lines, select credit, and then subsequently a button each time to play a game.
In the Perth environment rather than in the spinning reel environment.
And so just sticking with the spinning reel environment for a moment.
Yes.
So there are the 2-button sequence, number of lines, credit to play,
Yes.
the game starts,
Yes,
and then subsequent games, a button has to be hit again.
I believe so.
So you've got 2 buttons to start, and then for subsequent games, 1 button to go. In
Yes.
Western Australia, you've got 2 buttons to start for credit and bet value, then a start button, and then subsequent games are a start button as well.
Yes, that's correct.
So for all
As I
subsequent games at both jurisdictions, or at Western Australia and outside Western Australia, there is a single button that can be hit for the game to go.
Yes, I do accept that. Yes.
Okay. Now, we talked for a moment there about what you understand the word poker machine to mean. What is your understanding as to why poker machines are prohibited by the legislation?
I suppose my impression is, I'm not sure I've ever been specifically informed because obviously the legislation was before my time, but I would assume that it had RSG type considerations in relation to that determination in the legislation would be my, I suppose, what I would assume.
And we've earlier discussed the fact that you're generally aware of the potentially addictive nature of EGMs, and do I understand that to also extend to poker machines?
Yes, I think in general terms, yes.
And would you agree that one of the reasons why EGMs or poker machines are potentially dangerous is that players can engage in the repetitive action of just hitting a button to play new games over and over again?
I imagine potentially, yes.
And would you also agree that there is a potential for players with the repetitive sequencing that they are watching, the repetitive sounds, to be able to then ultimately enter into a dissociative state while playing? Is that something which you have generally heard about?
I think I have a general understanding of that, yes.
Would you agree that those sorts of characteristics I've just put to you, the repetitive action, the repetitive visuals, are things which are consistent both with EGMs in Western Australia and poker machines or spinning reel games as you describe them in other jurisdictions?
I would accept, I think there are risks in both in Western Australia and in other jurisdictions, yes.
Moving then to the national gaming standards, or the gaming machine national standard, which you've discussed at paragraph 155 of your witness statement. Can you just confirm at a general level whether the purpose for the standard is to create universal base performance and other characteristics to allow machines to be interoperable throughout the country?
This is the national standard
Yes.
document? Yes, my understanding is that that document is developed collectively between all of the jurisdictional gaming regulators in Australia and New Zealand, and that is a common set of principles to which EGMs will be developed and operate.
And then each state or territory often has their own appendix which they can add to the standard.
Yes, that's correct.
And then you say that you've been aware of the WA appendix since approximately 2004 or 2005.
I expect so.
Now, we don't seem to have a version of the standard that is that old. The earliest that we seem to have received is one in October 2009, which I'll show you. That's CRW.705.008.5846. And if we go, please, to page 12. And you can see there at WA 4.7, determination of poker machine.
Yes, I see that.
If we can please have this page and the next page side by side. Now, hopefully that's not too small for you to see, but would you agree that the factors which are set out in the table in those two columns are broadly the same factors that were present in the WA appendix consistently up until 2019?
I believe so.
And we'll come back to the September 2019 changes later. So for the moment, I'm only asking you about the appendix as it existed prior to those changes.
Yes.
Would you accept that some of the items in this table are material and others less material in that they largely duplicate requirements in the national standard that are already existing?
I'm not sure I understand I'm not sure I would understand from the listing there which of them may be replication from the national standard. I accept that may be possible, but I'm not clear in my own mind as to which ones may fall into that category.
Let's go through them sequentially. The first one, in terms of the appearance, you can see there's a discussion about the game shall not use a spinning reel display.
Yes.
And that's consistent with what you've explained earlier as to your understanding of what poker machines are. Really, it's significant that spinning reel is there.
Yes.
Putting aside the questions about having a handle or rotating the plane of the screen, would you agree that 1 and 3 are essentially inverse? That if it's a spinning reel, it won't be rotating the plane of the screen, but if it's rotating the plane of the screen, it won't be a spinning reel?
There's potentially a relationship between 1 and 3, I would accept, yes.
And I'll leave 4 until I get to point 11.
Yes.
Moving on to speed of play, what do you understand the expression speed of play to mean?
Basically, the minimum speed between the commencement of subsequent game play processes, I suppose.
So to put that in concrete terms, I hit the start button,
Yes,
and then the game is now playing.
yes,
I'm frantically hammering away at the start button trying to start the next game, but I'm only able to start it once the speed of play has elapsed. Is that correct? Is it right that all states have a speed of play requirement?
my understanding is it's a bit of a mixed position, and I'm happy to try and explain the detail of my understanding of it for you if you like. So as I understand it, Victoria has a specifically mandated speed of play position. I believe Queensland may also have a mandate, a specifically regulated or legislative speed of play. In New South Wales, my understanding is it may not actually be formally in regulation or legislation, but is an understood position with the regulator. And the other states, as I understand it, are essentially markets that are receiving product developed for one of those markets I've previously mentioned, such that they are receiving product inherently that has the speed that exists in those primary markets, albeit their legislation may not specifically articulate that position.
And would you agree that in general, the speed of play for most other states and territories is 3 seconds, and for Victoria it's 2.14? Is that your understanding?
My understanding.
So a speed of play requirement here for 5 seconds at this time was a material difference with the speed of play elsewhere.
Yes, it was.
Then player interaction, a requirement to choose a play strategy. That, if I understood your answer earlier, is also something which is the same for spinning reel machines in other jurisdictions. You still have to choose number of lines to bet, number of credits to bet per line.
Other than the mentioning of the start button in the second paragraph, I would agree. I think other than the start button element, I think broadly speaking, the bet selections are probably aligned.
Yep. And then, as we discussed earlier, even with the start button, you still have to press a button to play a new game, and likewise you have to press a button to play a new game at other jurisdictions.
Yes, accept that.
Then we've got return to player, minimum 90%.
Yes.
Do you understand that to, at this stage, have been a significant difference between the return to player that was available elsewhere in the country?
My understanding is it was somewhat higher than the other states in Australia, yes.
Other states have around 85%. Well, that's a common figure in other states.
Yes, I think 85 to 87 is about where most of the other states sit.
So that difference, you would agree, is a material difference in terms of what the standards were showing and what other jurisdictions might allow.
Yes.
In relation to fairness, which is point 5, the requirement that a player be able to determine how to play games, you might not be able to answer this off the top of your head from what you said earlier, but are you aware that those general requirements of fairness are also set out in the national standard?
I'm certainly conscious that there are fairness considerations in the national standard. Whether they're completely consistent, I couldn't talk to that level of detail.
Let's just call up GWC.002.0016.0186 and please go to page 73. So you can see there under 3.3, there's a series of dots as to requirements in the national standard.
Yes.
You can see, for example, the third dot point is clear game rules and instructions.
So could we just increase the size of that slightly? Apologies, yes, I say that now.
And then likewise, there's the fourth dot point.
I'm sorry, I missed the screen to identify what this document is.
Apparently I can't display the earlier page because there's a non-publication order, but this is the Gaming Machine National Standard 2016.
Thank you.
So just going back where we were, you can see that the fourth dot point, a requirement that there be no false information. The fifth dot point, the game not be misleading. And if we can now please go back to what we were looking at before, so that's CRW 705 008 5846. And looking here, generally in relation to the fairness points, determination of how to play the game. We saw before there was a requirement to have rules. There's a point there about prizes, but I'll go to number 3, not to be misled into the belief that there is control, so no misleading features.
Yes, I see that at number 3.
Would you agree that, broadly speaking, fairness is something mandated by the national standard, accepting there might be some variation on some of the points, and that this, as a result, is not a significant or material difference with the WA standard or the WA appendix?
I would accept there appears to be some similarity between the inclusions in both documents.
Rules of play, well, I don't think there's anything needs to be said about that. Misleading features, we've already looked at the national standard. Harm minimisation features, all monies to credit meter and start of gaming by a separate button. Can you explain the all monies to credit meter and what that means?
I believe it means after a win has occurred, the money has to go to the credit meter, so it has to be a transfer across to the credit meter before as part of the sequencing of how the funds transferred. But I'm not completely sure as to whether that is a specific distinction to other jurisdictions or not. I'm not completely sure.
That was into my next question, whether that's actually different to what happens with spinning reel games.
Apologies, I'm unsure as to the position in different markets on that matter.
Then looking at number 10, national standards, compliance to national standard, you agree that that's something which all EGMs or poker machines have to comply with the national standard?
Yes.
So again, that's a non-material distinction.
Yes, I think that's standard.
I'll come back to independence of outcome. In respect of chances of winning, what do you understand that to mean? And is it anything different than what would be the case with poker machines in other jurisdictions?
Not necessarily sure whether those elements are included in the national standard or not.
Do you understand the requirements there to be the same for spinning reel machines, or are these requirements different?
I'm not sure.
And lastly, in relation to wind truncation, is there anything about that standard which is set out there which is different ordinarily to poker machines?
I believe there may be some jurisdictions that operate wind truncation, but I'm not 100% sure in relation.
And is that just when you get to a certain size of wind, you can't go over a threshold? Is that what that means?
Yeah, I think it has a way of scaling down the value of the wind to fit within wind limits that may exist within a jurisdiction, is my broad understanding without being expert in that area.
All right. Now, just going back then to number 11, this independence of outcome. My understanding is that when you use a spinning reel machine, the reel has effectively a number of symbols in a fixed order.
Yes.
And when the random number generator selects symbols and shows sequences, they will always show in the same sequence that you're seeing them displayed. So that if, to use an example, if you have cat, hat, bat, anytime you have hat in the middle, you'll always have cat above and bat below.
Yes.
By contrast, when we see here at number 11 that you must have multiple outcomes being independent, that means that each symbol that is picked is then followed by a new pick, correct?
Yes.
And so you might have cat, hat, bat on one sequence and cat, cauldron, broomstick on another.
Yes.
And that requirement is consistent, isn't it, with what we see at point 1, sub point 4, that the symbol shall be drawn at random.
Yes, I think the reference in factor 1, item 4 in relation to the fixed positions, I think relates back to that, dynamic you mentioned where the symbols are in fixed relative positions to each other.
Okay. So having gone through that technical section, would you agree that broadly speaking, the particularly substantive aspects of this table, which create genuine differences between EGMs in Western Australia and perhaps poker machines in other jurisdictions, are the visual appearance in item 1?
Yeah, I suppose I'm happy to comment on it. I'm not sure. My view was that the Gaming and Wagering Commission is the party determining what is significant or not significant. So I've just prefaced my comments by saying I'm not sure it's my determination to assess that position, but certainly I'm happy to give you my feedback.
Well, I don't know what use the feedback will be, quite frankly. I think the answer that the witness has just given is about as far as it can go, rather than ask this witness what he thinks might be more or might not be quite as significant in comparing these to the national standards.
I think let's just see where it goes,
Yes, Commissioner.
Sure, that the witness is clear, has made it clear that he's just giving his impression.
Yes, so be it, Commissioner.
Mr. Sullivan, just going back to that question I was asking, we've gone through the individual items. In terms of your impression as to which of those individual items actually impose material distinctions with jurisdictions where there are poker machines, and here, do you agree that the visual appearance is material?
Yes, I would.
The speed of play is material?
Yes.
The RTP is material?
Yes.
And the independence of outcome for the selection of symbols is material?
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to add that in your view is material about what we've looked at with those items to the distinction between poker machines and non-poker machines?
I think the start or play button is a distinction. I think the determinations as to whether it's significant or not are perhaps individual ones, but I consider that a distinction. In relation to rules of play, the structure in Perth in relation to rules of play has historically been somewhat different to other markets. I think the position on the level of that distinction has shifted over time and perhaps become less significant over time, but I think there's a degree of distinction on the structure there. Wind truncation maybe, but I'm not informed enough to be able to really give you an assessment on that factor. chances of winning. I'm uncertain on chances of winning as well.
Okay. Of those various items that you've articulated, is it correct to say that in 2019, Crown suggested to the GWC that 3 of those factors should be amended, being the speed of play, the RTP, and the independence of outcome for the selection of symbols?
I believe a proposal was lodged for consideration of those factors, yes.
So on what basis did Crown, or if you're aware, or otherwise, did you form the view that those factors could be changed such that it would not materially move EGMs towards being poker machines? Why was it possible to change those factors and not have the distinction collapse?
Well, I think there are perhaps a couple of elements from my recollection in relation to that. One was that I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think Crown's view was it was the determination of the GWC as to which of these factors were more or less significant. So the proposal was for consideration to be given to those factors. Whether that was ultimately an acceptable proposal or not, didn't necessarily see as a decision for Crown, but a decision for the GWC to assess. The other element was from recollection, I think in relation to a couple of the factors that were being considered for review, I think Crown may have obtained a certification report from an ATF providing some commentary in relation to their assessment of those factors. So I think that may have been also a matter that may have formed part of the presentation that Crown made and may have been given consideration by the GWC in relation to, I think it may have been 1 or 2 of the factors within the W appendix from memory.
Understanding your point about ultimately it's a matter for the GWC to decide whatever it decides, were there any matters, any items in that table that you considered it would not be possible for Crown to suggest to the GWC to be changed without the machine becoming a poker machine? Or is it the case that, for example, the entire table could be replaced with some alternate item like machine must be pink and that would still be enough? Or is there some essential element to your mind which can't be transgressed with the machine still not being a poker machine?
I think certainly the one in there that would probably be difficult to overcome without removing the prohibition on spinning reels would be the visual distinction. So I imagine that would probably be the one that was the strongest differentiator to say this product looks and feels different to a spinning reel.
And lastly, why is that the thing that you seize upon out of all of those various factors in the table? Why is it that the visual aspect you see as being so critical?
I think it would simply be that the name spinning reel reflects essentially the nature of how that game operates. Therefore, if you were to remove that element and make it exactly the same, I'm not sure that distinction would be maintained, but that would just be my personal view. But
the word isn't determination of a spinning reel, it's determination of a poker machine. So you are taking an initial first step where you're saying that a poker machine is always a spinning reel machine. Is that correct?
Yes, I think I've explained my interpretation of the term poker machine is that it is a spinning reel.
And what's that based on, your understanding?
Just based on my historical impression, it certainly isn't. I mean, there's no, as I understand it, there's no definition of poker machine, so that's simply been my impression, having worked within the business over a period of time, my impression of what that was intended to mean. But I accept it's certainly not defined anywhere definitively.
Right. Commissioner, is that a convenient time?
Mr. Sullivan, we break for now, so we'll be back at 2 p.m. Thank you. 2 p.m. Thank you.
All rise.